That mixed economies are the best form of governance, there really is no consensus as to what the combination between government and market forces should be. This has led to the pursuit of a sort of economic alchemy, and thanks to the teachings of Wizard Keynes, governments and economists around the world believe that with just the right formula of government intervention, they can manipulate the element of human action to create wealth, the equivalent to an alchemist's gold. As a product of their constant experimentation, the results are becoming shoddier and shoddier. Rather than coming up with gold, the decades of failed experiments and overdoses of government intervention into the formula are now beginning to produce nothing but lumps of coal, stagflation. As they sit amongst their piles of coal and 1% growth rates, many look at China's recent growth rates of around 10% of GDP and are starting to think that the Chinese economic alchemists must have come up with the long sought-after formula. This is something they now call the China model, with ingredients of authoritarian rule, some form of free market, and a big role for the state enterprise and their projects. But in fact, the truth is, there is no magic formula. A golden economy cannot just be conjured up. It can only arise through an organic process in the free market. And as with gold, with growth, there is a sharp contrast between that which is real and that which just looks like it. Growth that comes from unnecessary and unbeneficial jobs and projects is nothing compared to the growth that results from useful productivity. In the same way, governments can print out paper money, but try as they might, they cannot create real wealth or gold. For precisely this reason, I would like to make the point that there is no China model. China has been doing some good things in recent years, but its success is entirely attributable to the introduction of the aspects of the free market. This country is no exception to the rule. With this talk, I hope to shed some light, firstly on the development of the free market in China, which is what is behind the country's astounding growth, and secondly on the government's behavior in quite recent times that threatens to destroy all that's been gained. This is a message I'd like to share, as it is of the utmost importance that the right lessons are taken from China's story. For if progress is inaccurately credited to government intervention and decline mistakenly attributed to the free market, then a great opportunity to improve lives and living standards will be missed. Beginning China's story at a time when its economic system was entirely centrally planned, one can barely ask for a better example of the benefits of the free market. For each incremental step the country has taken towards economic freedom has resulted in greater and greater prosperity for the people. So, let's take a look at how economic freedom, and let me stress, economic freedom alone, has completely transformed China. Well, one of the first and tiniest movements towards a market system took place in China's agricultural sector. Under Mao's dictatorship, all farms were operated as collectives. There was no private ownership of land, and farmers worked grown. And furthermore, it was decided that this province would grow rice. The people were then commanded to turn a mountainous landscape, such as this, into a flat, watery area, such as this. It's kind of difficult, you see. To do so, they were made to cut terraces into the rock face and lug soil, and then water up from miles away to stimulate the right conditions for growing rice. The result may be pretty, but the glaring inefficiencies were not. The terraces were so small that they couldn't accommodate machinery, and the ground was so hard, because it was rock, that the villagers were made to stand in rows and step in place for hours so as to soften the ground for planting. And even then, rice would barely grow, sometimes to the point that the amount harvested was even less than the amount put down in seed initially. As a result of this pervasive inefficiency, quotas were never filled and the people starved. Even after an entire year of hard labor spent growing rice, farmers had to borrow some back from the government just to have one bowl of rice, solid rice on New Year's. This is compared to their usual rice soup, which was usually so watery you could count the grains of rice in it. And that's the same thing they had every 364 days a week. June Chang, in her book Mao, The Unknown Story, has calculated that by 1960, the average daily caloric intake of the Chinese people was just 1,535 calories, which is comparable to the slave laborers in Auschwitz, and led to an estimated 38 million deaths in Mao's Great Leap Forward alone. But, luckily, when situations are extremely dire, people do whatever they can to survive. In some tiny, unnoticed villages in China, in the face of starvation, the farmers themselves defied their production teams and turned to private farming. At the end of 1978, 18 farmers in Xiaogang, or literally Small Hill Village, signed an agreement to secretly experiment with private farming. After their first harvest, because they were so successful in comparison with the communal farms, many of the surrounding villages in the Anhui province began to follow their example. Then, in 1980, 4 years after Mao's death, the authorities relaxed the laws and allowed private farming in the areas where even they admitted that the collective had clearly failed. Though the land was still owned by the government, the right to cultivate it was then divided between families, who were still required to fulfill a government quota, but were otherwise free to farm as they saw fit. Since the farmers then had a personal incentive to be productive, and were far more knowledgeable than the central planners about what crops their land was suitable for, after the very next harvest, starvation was no longer an issue. The government quotas, which had been previously impossible to meet, were based upon estimations for the inefficient collective farms. And as a result of the magnificent productivity gains of privatization, there was excess even after they were fulfilled. With just this small step of decentralizing decision-making power in agriculture, the transformation was immediate. Then, emboldened by such success, another step was taken towards economic freedom, in the form of creating special economic zones. Taking over the country's leadership after Mao's death, Deng Xiaoping admirably did not presume to know exactly how the country should be run. All he knew was that people were starving. And though he had no intention of abandoning the communist system altogether, he proposed that instead of blindly following communist ideology, and that instead the authorities should seek truth from facts, as he said. This attitude is what led to the implementation of special economic zones that would serve as a testing ground for capitalism. At first, the authorities were nervous about what might result, and thus the experiments took place in the poorest and most rural areas, where there was the least amount of existing state investment, and so as to minimize their impact if they failed. The most famous example of this economic experimentation is the case of Shenzhen. It was just a poor fishing village across the water from Hong Kong when it was made into the country's first special economic zone. But this meant less than you might think. It was not in any way a fully free and open market. In fact, only a tiny adjustment was made to allow foreign firms to enter the country, build factories, hire Chinese workers, and pay them as they saw fit. Regulation was still in place to ensure that what was produced went directly back out of the country. These zones were not intended to bring prosperity to the Chinese people, but were instead meant as a source of revenue for the Chinese government in foreign currency. But opening the country just a crack released a flood of change. Communist teachings had said that capitalism exploits workers, but reality taught them otherwise. The lowest level factory workers in these foreign companies were earning up to 5 times as much as the income of college graduates in the rest of the country. Needless to say, people rushed to these areas in the pursuit of opportunity. After 30 years, Shenzhen went from having 30,000 residents to having a population of 14 million, making it the 3rd largest country in in China, or the third largest city in China. Try as they might, it was then impossible for the authorities to limit these areas' impact. They were no longer able to use propaganda against capitalism successfully. They didn't even believe it themselves anymore. The biggest steps, however, that were taken towards the free market were ones that the Chinese government did not take intentionally. In the past 30 years, the country experienced areas of free market capitalism much beyond that in developed countries today. But this was able to happen mostly because the bureaucratic system was either incapable of maintaining control or intervening quickly enough. This is again why I stress that the government's model is not one to follow. For example, a source of pride for the communist leadership was to say that they had entirely eliminated unemployment, but which was in truth just a technicality. Aside from farmers, all people were assigned jobs for life. Their wages were determined centrally, divided between two categories of blue collar and white collar, and according to the year that that person started working. Apparently, even under the dictatorship of the proletariat, the official wages for the proletariat were lower than those of intellectual occupations. As a result, there were no incentives to be good workers. For as an old Soviet joke goes, under communism, we all had jobs. They pretended to pay us, and we pretended to work. And what's more, the factories produced goods and set prices not according to the market demand, but according to the decisions of central planners. Well, just as Margaret Thatcher once said, the trouble with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money. Thus, despite the revenue from foreign firms, the special economic zones, the government simply could not afford to prop up the inefficient system it had created. Consequently, under Deng's leadership, guaranteed employment and support for non-essential state factories were eliminated. So what is often mistakenly interpreted as a program of privatization in China's story was in fact just the government cutting funding, and the economy was laissez-faire. Factories that weren't able to sell their goods quickly ran out of money to pay salaries, and in some cases, workers received the unsold goods as their wages. This started off a wave of entrepreneurial activity, as people quickly took to selling these goods on the streets just to survive. Unsustainable factories closed down, and the ones that remained became productive in their pursuit of profit. In some factories, workers collectively struck up deals to lease the factories from the state and run them themselves. By just eliminating the government-imposed job security, instantly people had incentives to be productive, even without any prior experience of the market. No one needed to be taught what to do. This burst of productivity was magnified due to the fact that the transformation was so sudden that the government hadn't had a chance to intervene in the marketplace just yet. There weren't any of those zoning laws and rules and regulations over businesses that suffocate entrepreneurs around the world. There were no business licenses or restrictions on where things could be sold. People just sold anything they could get their hands on, and anywhere they could find customers. This enabled any home or building to become a factory, store, or clinic. And even when the regulations did exist, with the right connections and bribes, there was still the potential to operate freely. As The Economist magazine explains, provincial politicians, whose career prospects are tied to growth, often let these outfits operate free, not only of direct state management, but also from many of the laws tied to land ownership, labor relations, taxation, and licensing. Bamboo capitalism lives in a laissez-faire bubble. But now, the question is, where is China heading today? Though initially, activity arose and spread too quickly for the government to try to control it, sadly, 30 years have given the Chinese government time to start catching up. In fact, it has jumped right in to the marketplace itself, making the communist Chinese government the largest capitalist institution in the world. On the Fortune 500 list, 46 firms are Chinese, and 40 of those wholly state-owned. Whereas national monopolies in many other parts of the world are known for continuously losing money, those in China have been using their powers that no other firms have in order to push itself to the top and make as much profit as possible. One way it does this is by pushing down the costs of state firms, by either being a monopolist owner or by making itself a monopsonist, sole buyer of the country's resources. We can see this with the example of coal, which is becoming increasingly valuable as the country industrializes, leading it to experience a sort of gold rush as private mines have popped up everywhere and the government can't control them. Without a monopoly over the resource, the state still gets its way by forcing the private mines not only to sell their coal to the state, but even for below the market price. Another way the government is trying to get to the top is by using propaganda to aid its competition. Very recently, the state-run media firm CCTV has come out with a campaign against Baidu, the country's largest search engine, saying that it facilitates fraud. Even more incredibly, it accuses the company, which holds about 75% of market share, for behaving monopolistically, of all things. Oh, and on a side note, completely unrelated of course, CCTV has just launched its very own search engine. So, in general, much of the evidence of this trend can be seen as Xinhua News Agency, the official propaganda machine of the Chinese government, has now just replaced HSBC's spot in advertising in New York's Times Square. Clearly, by this, you can see that the Chinese government has begun to embrace the capitalist system, but it has done so more as a tool it can bend to its will for its own particular gain, rather than for being a better system for the country and its people in general. Well, once the Chinese government officially accepted the adoption of capitalism for the good of socialism, it has been working hard to learn exactly what a capitalist system involves. Unfortunately, however, its only teachers are the mixed economies of the so-called developed countries and the mixed-up theories of John Maynard Keynes. One stereotype of the Chinese is that they're good students, but this is dangerous when they're learning all the wrong lessons. Keynes' ideas empower governments with the idea that they have the ability to manipulate the economy, for he is the one that suggests that with just the right formula, demand-side stimulus, it is possible to create gold. Attempts at economic alchemy with Keynes' formula has been the downfall of so many Western countries today, yet most economists continue to stick by it, insisting that they failed just because the formula wasn't applied correctly, saying things like, there just wasn't enough stimulus. Well, China, learning from the worst, is quickly making these very same mistakes. And what's more, without requiring democratic legitimacy before acting, it is able to make them sooner and grander than the countries it is trying to emulate. This can be seen most clearly with the example of real estate in China. Well, to start off, the Chinese government owns all the land in the country. It leases it out for use, but ultimately it has control over the quantity available. During the most recent recession, this power served as a very useful Keynesian tool to boost growth in terms of nominal GDP. The government then applied a mixture of extremely low interest rates and increased availability of land to fuel a construction boom. By closely administering the Keynesian formula, the government brought about effectively the same kind of real estate bubble that led off the 2008 recession in the US. Nevertheless, China was praised all around the world for having the sufficient treasury power to successfully apply the Keynesian prescribed stimulus. But now, with some delay, Chinese economists are learning the hard way about the side effects of Keynesian prescriptions. For with stimulus comes inflation, which quickly cancels out any benefits such policies might have had. And now, faced with rapidly rising real estate prices, as well as overall inflation, the government is looking to its book of alchemy once again. Out of desperation, the government is now imposing legislation such as that to fine companies that raise their prices. Please take a moment to fully appreciate how ridiculous that is. First, the government creates a bubble, creates a real estate bubble that makes prices go up. And then, once they realize that it is becoming a problem, they fine the real estate companies that are listing the higher prices. And this is really happening. Just this past July, 18 real estate companies were fined a total of 4 million renminbi for increased real estate prices, as if the prices are their doing. Furthermore, as to be expected, inflation didn't stick with real estate, but it's affecting all goods. So the government is even doing the same to consumer goods producers. Unilever is one example, which was recently hit with a 2 million renminbi fine. At the same time, in order to help wages keep up with inflation, each province is rapidly increasing its minimum wage levels. Earlier this year, Beijing's minimum wage rate was increased by 21%, which was the second such increase in just 6 months. This is particularly detrimental to low-skilled laborers and is making the country less and less competitive for manufacturing. Higher labor costs, combined with the inability to raise prices to cover them, are quickly creating an inhospitable environment for business. Such poorly thought out policies show very clearly the government economists' lack of understanding in regards to how the market really works, and how deeply they believe in having the power to manipulate every aspect of it. Strangely enough, there may be some benefits to the deterioration of China's free market being rapid rather than gradual. An example of this is the fact that the Chinese people have not yet developed the kind of dependency on the state that plagues the economies of countries where welfare states have been in place for generations. Things like healthcare and university educations are all paid for upon use. And though the costs may be subsidized, there's no expectation on their part that the services should be provided by the government for free. This has contributed to the high savings culture in China as people budget and prepare for future potential costs. The sharp contrast to countries with welfare states and Keynesian policies, which have done their best to discourage this big habit. This sense of self-reliance is also apparent when it comes to job seekers. Even under Mao's rule, there was no sympathy for those who did not contribute to society through work. Thus, the Chinese people who face potential unemployment are much more mobile, ready to move across the country or across the world in search of opportunity, or they turn to entrepreneurship. However, on the other side of the world, with welfare benefits such as council housing to keep one stationary and a host of other support schemes to diminish one's drive, labor mobility in developed countries has been in decline for some time. These simple differences between governments' policies have a vastly different impact on society. And the fact that people in China still tend to behave as if they are in a free market society, where they must be responsible for their own lives. This keeps them capable of taking care of themselves and ready for change. In fact, not only are they ready for change, but they are calling for it. Along with globalization has come the internet, as we've seen in the Arab countries. And despite the Chinese government's tremendous efforts to erect the Great Firewall of China, the internet is increasingly giving the people a taste of freedom and democracy. Microblogging sites, such as Weibo in particular, have been an exceptional medium of expressing public opinion. And because of their widespread popularity, the government is finally starting to pay attention to the demands of the people. The high-speed train crash that took place in July itself was a great tragedy. But what was even worse was the authorities' handling of the situation. They fumbled each step they took, and an audience of bloggers was right there to point out each mistake they did. Incredibly, one of the very first actions of the rescue workers at the scene was to hurriedly bury the first train car so as to protect it from investigation. In spite of strong efforts to censor anything on the topic of the crash, widespread outrage boiled over on the internet against this. The outcry was so great that the authorities were forced to respond, and in fact dug the car back up and sent it. Just as the bureaucratic system was unable to keep up with the rise of spontaneous order, now it is struggling to keep up with the incredible speed with which information and news spreads on the internet, providing the Chinese people with another taste of freedom. Even Austrian ideas are included in the mix, with the microblogs of Austrian economists having tens and hundreds of thousands of followers. I've even seen one with over 1 million followers. Where else can you find such a large audience in search of genuine alternatives? In conclusion, my intention here today has been to bring light to the true causes of China's astounding growth, as well as its deceleration. The idea that a China model of a bit of capitalism guided by active authoritarian leadership is the key to economic success is not only wrong, but is dangerous to believe. China's adoption of a market economy and its subsequent success provides a perfect, large-scale, and indisputable example of the virtues of the free market, which even in such small doses had miraculous results. Therefore, if the wrong lessons are learned from China's story, one of the greatest opportunities to promote the free market and improve people's lives will be lost forever.
Another deep liberal principle called the presumption of liberty. This is what Egyptians and many people around the world lack. The big building on Tahrir Square, everybody knows it in Cairo because you have to go there for every permission, for everything. And so this is part of the social inequality. You are at their mercy. You're humiliated by them. You have to pay them bribes. Everyone has to go to this one building where you're humiliated, reduced in your humanity, and shaken down for money. Because it's presumed you may not do anything without permission. The background condition is coercion, and you need permission to have freedom to do something. But the liberal approach is the opposite of that, and that's the key. You're presumed to be free to do anything you want unless there is a reason you should be stopped. The burden of proof is on the authorities to stop you, not on you to do it. Egypt lives under the presumption of power. And this creates corruption, opportunities for theft, and social humiliation. Because someone has power over you, they'll use over you. It's also one of the reasons these are stable. This is one of the reasons for Soviet tyranny persisting. Everyone had some power over others to give them an exemption. I won't arrest you now, I won't charge you for this product, and so on. So the lowest person had a little power over other people. It's a really corrupting system. What they did in Georgia to eliminate corruption, or let me be more honest, to reduce it dramatically, and it was really reduced, you just feel it, was they instituted the silence equals consent principle. If you apply for a permit from the government, first they abolished the majority of permits, were just abolished. They said, for each permit, why do we have it? If there's no good answer, they said abolish it. So most were abolished, from 950 down to 100 and something. So it's pretty dramatic. Second, if you apply for it, and after 30 days you have not received an answer, the answer is yes. So the burden is on them to stop you, not on you to induce them to improve it. But that did more to eliminate corruption than all of the posters and campaigns and TV ads in official anti-corruption campaigns. It changed the burden of proof. The bureaucrat must show why you should not be allowed to do it. You do not have to show why you should be allowed. And that's something that is being discussed in Egypt, to introduce that kind of reform and remove this power to humiliate and shake people down that is exerted by the bureaucracy.
In China, they have a solution, the firing squads. They shoot corrupt officials.
Teams that brought about a process of revenge have not done very well. The lustration process that a number of countries went through, Czechoslovakia was the first, where people who had this bad history had to go through a kind of illumination process. It was made clear, if you run for public office, these files will be revealed. You are an agent, you are an informer. But otherwise, we close them. And we close the door on the past. And I think that's the best. Even criminal people who did bad things, except for very extreme cases, much better to close the door and move forward rather than to exact revenge. And the pattern is very clear over time. Revenge yields more hatred, more violence, and it just builds on itself. Better to close the door, to say, if you decide to be in public life, we will reveal what you did. But otherwise, just go. And I think that's a better approach. Yeah.